Thank you, Elliot. I really very much like Joyce Pauly's hymns. I wish Joyce Pauly were still among us. Well, good morning, friends. I hope you don't mind if I sit. The years pass and I am increasingly rickety, as you can see only too well. I grew up some 2 miles from here in a cocoon of expatriate Britishness. There were totem poles in Stanley Park, but for me as a kid, Indigenous people were out of sight. Now, near the end of my life, I have begun to rectify my non-seeing. Recently, I teamed up with archaeologists and an anthropologist to write on the Sinixt, the people of the Slocan Valley of southeastern British Columbia, where my English and Scottish grandparents settled in the late 1890s. This sermon is a Sinixt report, a Sinixt-based reflection. This is a little booklet that we've produced. I have a series of such booklets on the Slocan Valley, and this one covers the last 3,000 years of the Sinixt. It was by far the most, because the native issues are so much to the fore and so much contested in British Columbia, it's by far the most difficult to write. Sermons are not easy to write either, and I'm not a writer of sermons, as you will see. But my remarks raise moral issues that draw us into sermon territory. Sinixt have lived in considerable numbers in the Slocan Valley for at least 3,000 years. But few were there when a mining rush arrived in the summer of 1891. By 1900, even these few were gone. It's in this that one finds the nub of a moral issue. In the mid-18th century, and I've tried to figure out what Sinixt life was like in the middle of the 18th century, working through ethnographic reports. In the middle of the 18th century, the Sinixt lived through the winter in pithouse villages like the one shown here. Oh my goodness, it is up there. Great. An artist's reconstruction of a house on the Slocan River that archaeologists have carbon-14 dated to about 1,000 years ago. Dug well into the ground and covered with layers of poles, then dirt or sod. They were snug. Several families lived in the larger ones. Entrance was through the smoke hole in the roof. In the spring, when they left the pit houses, the Sinixt lived in conical lodges, teepees, covered with reed mats or hides. There were 6 winter villages in the Slocan, 3 along the lake, 3 along the river. Behind them were mountains, in front a waterway. The Sinixt used both in intricate detail. In their sturgeon-nosed canoes, they traveled through the principal Kootenai waterways. They hunted mountain goat in the high alpine. Their diet depended on fish, principally salmon, many game animals, and plants. They named, this has astonished me, they named and used at least 260 plant species, some for materials, some for ceremonial or medicinal purposes, most for food. Women harvested, prepared, and preserved this food, work that reflected a long accumulation of local knowledge. They knew where to find particular plants, how to encourage them, usually with burns, controlled burns. They weeded with digging sticks. They planted small bulbs and corms. They worked at the edge of agriculture. They transformed the Slocan into a mosaic of human landscapes. I hadn't understood that before. I thought of the Slocan as wilderness. It was not. It was a humanized landscape. The Sinixt appointed temporary leaders to to manage ceremonial dances, the spring salmon fishery, war parties, deer drives, the spring burns. Each village had a head person, usually a man, though their principal role seems to have been to encourage consensus. They considered themselves a people. They spoke a distinctive dialect of an interior Salish language, also spoken by Okanagan and Colville peoples. They knew and defended their territorial boundaries. They shared creation stories. And they lived within a well-developed consensus about moral behavior. Parents and elders instructed children. Stories contained moral teachings. There were clear rules about sexual behavior, rules within an understood yet weakly hierarchical social order. Like other indigenous people, they lived in a world in which the human and the non-human, the animate and the inanimate, were not separate categories, where everything was interrelated. Looking back almost 3 centuries later, I am struck by the extent to which the Sinixt lived off their own territory. A little obsidian and basalt arrived from afar, some bitter root from Okanagan, but overwhelmingly they lived off foods and materials obtained within their own lands. To do so required a vast store of local knowledge. It's really important to understand that. Theirs were knowledge-based societies, but unlike our knowledge, most of which was placeless, theirs was local. It fit a particular place. I'm also struck by their ability to work out codes of conduct and standards of behavior within largely egalitarian societies, and to live comfortably with the land through long periods of time. I am struck by their sense of the interrelated wholeness and oneness of their world. I have the strong sense that I have reached the edge of a drastically different way of being. In the early 1780s, a smallpox epidemic that began in Mexico City spread north into the New Mexican pueblos, then through the plains, then far into the boreal forest. David Thompson reported tents on the western plains in which everyone was dead, and wolves were eating the corpses. Later in the Rocky Mountain Trench, he reported that smallpox had preceded him. Measles and influenza were also lethal. These diseases reached the Sinixt. Their population probably declined by 80 to 90%. We think of the dislocations in our society with COVID and with an overall population drop of a small fraction of 1%, 80 to 90% depopulation. When the Hudson's Bay Company established a fur trade post on the Columbia River in what is now American territory, it almost immediately drew Sinixt, some of whom settled nearby. Some apparently became farmers. National censuses in 1880 and 1881 enumerated 325 Sinixt in the United States and 18 in Canada. Though I'm suspicious of these figures, especially given the wanton killing of Indians in a succession of American Indian wars. We know that in 1890, on the eve of a mining rush, there were still Sinixt in the Slocan Valley. at most the better part of 100, at least 3 or 4 families. The mining rush itself seems to have been decisive. It brought thousands of miners and camp followers, instant boom towns, that's Sandon, tucked away in the mountains above Slocan Lake, instant boom towns, spur lines of railways, and an aggressive frontier industrial capitalism that had been worked out in the American West in the aftermath of the Californian gold rushes. The mining rush came, took, and left. The small, rich Slocan mines were high-graded and abandoned. The forests were cut, but principally burned by miners careless about fire, or who deliberately burned to facilitate prospecting. Look at this. The building on at the bottom right is a concentrating mill, and the trellis across leads to a railway that is obliterated in an avalanche. But look at the hillside behind. That was a recently forested, densely forested landscape, and you see what has happened to it. There are no trees there. And the same was true through much of the valley. The place is scalped. The speculative greed was in the air. Among the casualties was a pillaged land. Also the Sinixt, who, confronted by completely alien ways and disparaged by a suddenly dominant population, apparently left the Slocan. Some probably found their way to adjacent indigenous nations, others to a reservation in the United States. The short, destructive energy of a mining rush had pushed out people whose ancestors had lived comfortably with the Slocan for thousands of years. The valley is still recovering. A few Sinixt have since returned to the valley. A burial site has been occupied and defended. A court case over hunting rights has gone to the Supreme Court of Canada to be decided last year in the Sinixt's favor. Overall, I've told an edge of a hemispheric story that began when Columbus stumbled into a Caribbean world inhabited by some millions of peaceable farming and fishing peoples, the Arawaks. 40 years later, by 1530, 40 years later, most of them were gone, killed by disease or by conditions for enslaved labor in Spanish gold or silver mines. The story carries on variously from there, but always in ways that imposed outsiders on other peoples and their lands. Yet from the moment that Europeans began to know the Western Hemisphere, it is hard to see how their encroachments could have been stopped. Introduced diseases would have run their horrendous course. Reports of riches coupled with geopolitical rivalries would draw European states. Their resources would draw commercial capital. The land would draw settlers. When the balance of power lay with the Europeans, as it usually did, indigenous people could not stop this coming. Before Europeans arrived, they themselves, opportunities permitting, engaged in such taking, as its peoples worldwide. In British Columbia, more than 3 centuries after Columbus, the imbalance of power was overwhelming. Indigenous populations had been decimated by disease. An incoming population was backed by an industrial technology and the administrative arsenal of the modern state. At times, indigenous groups considered fighting, while knowing they could not win. A few hangings a few shellings of coast villages by Royal Navy frigates established the realities of power. So here we are. Although not of the generations that came and took, we live off the avails of successful settler colonialism. Yet for most of us, British Columbia is now our home, and we do not plan to leave. If we did, others would come. What then do we do? We are deeply committed to kind, loving relationships with people, to social justice. But that is easily said. What do we do? I wish I had a succinct and compelling and definitive answer, but I don't. I have no more than some sense of how to proceed. I would ask first that we not be too hard on ourselves. Virtually all of us in the United Unitarian Church of Vancouver are products of recent migrations to British Columbia. If one looked into these comings, one would find lives lived with a good deal of courage, fortitude, and beauty. And if one compared these lives with those in the places whence they had come, one would find much that had changed. Lives are lived differently in different places. In this lies the creative side of settler colonialism. Creation and destruction, not only of indigenous peoples and ways. I think of Carter in M.A. Granger's remarkable little novel, Woodsman of the West. Carter grew up on a rock farm in Nova Scotia, left at an early age because his family could not support him, knocked around on the prairies, and ended up in British Columbia when the government was distributing timber leases. Carter acquired one in Knight Inlet, and there, with a ramshackle donkey engine and a few men, attacked and butchered the forest with the intensity of a Captain Ahab in pursuit of the white whale. The timber lease was his chance to become somebody. During the Slocan mining rush, there were many Carters. And yet, I have come away from my encounter with the Sinixt with the feeling that their going from the Slocan has been a tragedy. With them went a level of knowledge of the valley that has not been reproduced. So too, a capacity to live locally. So too, a lived understanding of interdependence. In the world we are entering, these qualities seem critical. Without them, the Slocan seems far less able to defend itself. I am far from the only one to reach this conclusion. At the end of her book on sea lice and salmon in the Broughton Archipelago, Alexandra Morton says the following, I quote, "While giving control over what happens to salmon runs to First Nations scares some people, consider this. Indigenous governments are entirely focused on very specific regions, right, without the need to consider international trade. This difference is critical to life on Earth. While the big picture is important, it immobilizes governments who are trying to satisfy international corporate needs and keep biological systems functioning to produce clean air, water, and food. We are extremely lucky that the First Nations of British Columbia were not exterminated by colonialism and that they are combing through the ashes, revisiting their secret places, reviving their languages, and seeking wisdom from their elders to rebuild governments based on humans and nature as one. Close quote. That is it exactly. Our country faces basic questions. The extent of indigenous rights to land, the nature and power of indigenous governments, the relationship of such governments to the Canadian state. We will not be at peace with ourselves until these matters are worked out. It will not be easy, partly because they impinge so differently on differently positioned lives. It is far easier, for example, for urban members of settler society to favor the return of lands to Indigenous people than it is for those other settlers who, perhaps for several generations, have lived on and loved the very land in question. But we have to work this out. And I hope we can in ways that involve a wholesome respect for Indigenous people, an appreciation of their knowledge, and an understanding of the oneness of being. Above all, there needs to be a good deal of sharing. We will not be a happy country if we create islands of defensive difference. Sinixt elders encountered in anthropologists' field notes have brought me to this point. I would thank them if I could. I would tell them that I'm a member of a congregation in which, as our land acknowledgement says, we seek, quote, we seek to learn and grow and build in a new way with Indigenous people and the very land itself. Such a commitment, seriously pursued, would take us a very long way. So be it.